Welcome, everyone. I'm Sabrina Roach, Digital Equity Lead for Washington State University Extension. I use she and her. Please put your introductions in the chat, your name, pronouns, organizational affiliation, and relationship to this statewide local community digital equity planning. So we will be posting the video made from this session and some notes if we have them, and your questions online later. We've got Kayla Wells-Yoakum, as usual, County Director of WSU Okanagan Extension. She's on meeting logistics. You can chat with her directly if you have technical difficulties. All right. So today's purpose, we are going to be learning how to more accurately gauge affordability in your area and what it means for potential federal and state funding. There's some significant information there. So we'll be learning about how BEAD allows for local customization of affordability measures. So you have quite a bit of power at the local level to make these decisions. And you'll have this opportunity to contribute to the advocacy of, for who gets support in your area and who gets enough support. Dharma will be talking about that. First, we have Annie Kuchlik, researcher at the University of Washington. And Annie, can you correct me if I said your name incorrectly?
You did really well, and it's not an easy one, so good work. Kuchlik it is.
Fantastic. Okay, you've got a PowerPoint deck, and I am distributing this PowerPoint deck if you want it. My email address will be going in the chat, and I'm going to be happy to send it to you. All right. We already arranged for me to do that with permission.
Yeah, definitely. And there are also some notes that I included below in case folks are interested in sort of following along to those too. But let me get this presentation up and then share it with you all. Sorry, just a second. I'm just having some trouble with the share here.
You're now the co-host.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank Kayla for that.
All right. I'm just having trouble. So sorry to share this with everyone, but here we go. Okay. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to get to speak to you all. My name, again, is Annie Kuchlik. I'm a researcher at the University of Washington School of Social Work. We are a small research center called the Center for Women's Welfare. And our primary role at the University of Washington is producing what we call the Self-Sufficiency Standard. And I'll go into the details of the Self-Sufficiency Standard for you all today, but I wanted to start by an introduction of the official poverty measure, just to give you a sense of why the Self-Sufficiency Standard was started. And for those of you who utilize the official poverty measure, it's also a way of understanding some of the inadequacies that come with it. So what I gather today is that what you're all trying to do is really understand affordability in your own communities. I'm not here necessarily to tell you how to define affordability, and I'm certainly not the expert in each of your communities. But what I'm hoping to do with this presentation is really to give you another tool to understand costs in your area and county specifically, and also by family type, and also to really understand the importance in using a reliable measure to understand community need. So as I mentioned, I wanted to start with just going over quickly the official poverty measure and sort of talk about the origins of that. So many of you maybe know this as the federal poverty guidelines or the official poverty line. It was originally designed in 1965 by a woman named Molly Warshansky, who worked and found that the Department of Agriculture survey in 1955 generally said that families spent about 1/3 of their budgets on food. And she used that and then was able to price out what was the cost of an economy food plan, which at that time and still to this day was really just meant for an emergency use purpose. She multiplied that food budget by 3 and then used that to calculate the poverty thresholds. So that has only been updated for inflation since that 1965 calculation, and everything else about the methodology behind that has stayed the same for about 6 decades. And you might be thinking, okay, why does this matter? What's this have to do with affordability? But this is the measure that is now used and most widely used to set eligibility thresholds for benefits like SNAP and WIC, or for childcare assistance. It's also used by the census to provide the official poverty count for the United States. So it's really widely used still, and there are some really big issues with it. The first issue is the fact that it doesn't have any geographic variation. So it fails to account, other than Alaska and Hawaii, for any regional variation. So someone is considered poor at the same threshold in Seattle that they are in a rural area in Iowa, for example. So in 2023, today, the official poverty measure counts a family of 2 in poverty at the level of 19,720. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the OPM is the same in every county and state. In Washington, it varies, self-sufficiency standard varies dramatically. So you'll notice that the color kind of coordinates with variation in cost. And I'll go into this a little bit more deeply, but I just wanted to recognize in this slide that there is significant variation even by county level. So the self-sufficiency standard in 2023 varies from $50,740 a year to over $93,854 a year for one adult and one preschooler. So thinking about that in comparison with that $19,720 mark. Those costs actually vary dramatically more too when there's an infant, not just a preschooler present. The other big limitation, which I just hinted at, is that the official poverty measure doesn't actually adjust for the age of children. And as we know, childcare is a substantial portion of the budget for families with young children. And of course, right now, I'm sure families with teenagers are also absolutely feeling the crunch of having increased food costs as well. So the poverty measure is really now meant to be a statistical yardstick, with federal programs using multiples of it for program eligibility. Molly Warshansky really presented this poverty threshold as a measure of income inadequacy, not as a measure of income adequacy. She really meant that this was meant to be a measure of deprivation, of how much is too little, and it really doesn't provide programs or policymakers a tool for helping families out of poverty. That said, it is still widely used, and so it can be used as an assessment, as a comparison tool. But the reason the self-sufficiency standard arose and was born in 1996 was to really address these shortcomings. So the self-sufficiency standard, which we calculate at the University of Washington School of Social Work, it's calculated by taking a market basket approach of measuring the cost of each basic need individually. So we take housing, childcare, healthcare, groceries, miscellaneous expenses, which now include broadband and cell phone costs, taxes and tax credits. We have an emergency savings calculation and transportation. And we account for the geographic differences in costs. So we look at costs by county. In Washington state, we actually do some within county variation as well because of the housing cost variation that happens in some of the larger metropolitan regions of our area. So that is also available for folks who are living within those areas. And I can show you that at the end of the presentation too. And then the standard also varies by the age group of children. So we have infants, preschoolers, school age children, and teenagers. Ultimately, we produce a self-sufficiency standard for 719 different family types in each county in Washington. It is necessary to note that the standard is calculated to be a minimally adequate measure. It's really just meant to calculate the income that would be needed to meet just the basic needs without any public benefits such as SNAP, childcare assistance, or Medicaid. We do recognize how critical those are for folks, but what this measure is showing is really just the cost of basic needs that someone has to afford. So we don't assume any informal assistance such as childcare or help from a relative or neighbor or accessing food from a food bank. It's really meant to be a very bare bones basic needs budget. And with that said, I'm going to now dive into some presentation of the data for 2023. So we haven't actually released the report that will be accompanying this data. We're actually working on a demographic report, which I'll kind of go into in a little bit. But this shows the self-sufficiency standard calculations for 3 different counties. So you'll see King County, Seattle, Lincoln County, and Thurston County, and then 4 different family types. So the blue represents 1 adult, the orange represents an adult and a preschooler, the gray represents an adult, preschooler, and school-age child, and the 2 adults, the green represents 2 adults, 1 school-age child, and 1 teenager. So sort of as a family grows and ages along the spectrum. And you'll notice that those costs vary very dramatically by the type of family. So you'll have a single adult in Seattle needing about $43,000 a year, which more than doubles when they add a preschooler and school-age child because of the cost of childcare that's added onto that. And then using the same family types and the same counties, I wanted to offer a comparison with the federal poverty guidelines. So you'll notice that this is now a percentage of the federal poverty guidelines instead of the numeric cost of the self-sufficiency standard. So you have in Lincoln County, a single adult or a adult or 2 adults with a school-age child and teenager, the costs range from about 184% of the official poverty line up to 349%. And that dotted red line represents 100% of the federal poverty guidelines. So you can really see that the official poverty measure is not capturing how much a family needs in order to get by at a minimal basic needs level. And then finally, this shows the different cost components that go into a family budget. So this is for a 1 adult and school-age child family. And you'll notice that housing takes up the largest proportion of the family budget. In King County, Seattle, that's particularly burdensome at $2,300 a month. Then you add on childcare costs, which for a school-age child are before and after school care plus full-time summer care. And then you have the food costs, transportation costs, taxes and tax credits included in there, as well as healthcare costs. We assume healthcare costs are employer-sponsored healthcare. So we do assume that folks in the self-sufficiency standard are working and therefore have work-related expenses. And we do assume that an employer would cover healthcare costs. We have calculated when, a healthcare cost when someone would access that from the individual market. So that is something that we've done in the past, but for Washington State, we do assume that it's employer-sponsored. I have all of the detail on where we get our sources, and I'm happy to answer that and some of the questions. I'm unable to monitor the chat, so sorry if there's questions coming through, but I will get to those after. But if people are interested in understanding exactly where we're getting all of these different sources, we have many resources available. We have a technical appendix online, and I also am happy to answer some questions too. So the first part of that presentation was really focusing on the self-sufficiency standard costs. So really what makes up a family's budget, the variation that we have, the cost components that go into it. The second data set that we produce, and this is different, it's a completely different data set, is we produce a understanding or a data set that shows how many households in a particular state, in this example, Washington, fall below the self-sufficiency standard thresholds. So in order to do this, we use the American Community Survey data set, which is part of the census data set. There's a public use micro data sample. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this and have potentially used it in your own work. The 2021 data set is the most recent that we have available. So we use a 2021 self-sufficiency standard to tie and understand and benchmark with that 2021 American Community Survey data set. So we start by calculating that 2021 data set for the standard, and then we create a data set of Washington households from the American Community Survey. We use the household, not the individual. So we add up the incomes of all the householders within the household. And then we add that up and we benchmark it with the same family type that we have tied with the self-sufficiency standard. So it becomes a very detailed process of looking at the exact family type from the American Community Survey, looking at the ages of children, tying those with the benchmark for a particular area, county or Puma in Washington state. And then we use that to understand, do they fall below the self-sufficiency standard benchmark, or are they falling above the self-sufficiency standard? And using that, we have calculated a 2021 data set, and we will be releasing a report shortly with more information on that. But what we did find was that 28% of households in Washington state are unable to make ends meet according to the data that we've produced. So a pretty high, a pretty significant amount, and certainly higher than what the official poverty measure recognizes. As I mentioned, that finding, the 28% of households do not have incomes to cover their basic needs according to our self-sufficiency standard research. And that actually varies pretty dramatically by county as well. So you'll notice in this figure, you see a range from 24 to 40%, with sort of the Eastern Washington counties having a higher percentage of households who aren't able to cover their costs with their incomes, as measured by the American Community Survey data set. So that's a lot of information, and I'm hoping there's some good questions. I did want to wrap up by just talking about our partner that we have in Washington state. So we work with the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County. They are the ones that fund the self-sufficiency standard, along with the report that we're producing this year. They have a really helpful tool called www.thecalculator.org. And you can go on there and have a really sort of user-friendly way of interacting with the self-sufficiency standard data. You can have users who go in and say, okay, what if I'm cutting back my hours at work to accommodate training? Will I still be able to meet this bottom line of basic needs? Or if I don't have enough money to cover my basic expenses, are there resources or public work supports that can help me fill those gaps? It's a really useful way of accessing the data in, again, a user-friendly way. The other way in which you can access data is, I'll show you after I talk about this, which is, I just wanted to mention that a couple years ago, Washington State passed this RCW, which really essentially created a consolidated standards of need that aligns with the self-sufficiency standard. So this is now in Washington state law. The self-sufficiency standard should be used as a measure of basic need. All right, and then lastly, I'm just going to show you quickly how to access the self-sufficiency standard data from our website. So you can use that. I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare on my screen here. So, oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry about that. So if you go to our website, which is the self-sufficiency-standard.org, you can hopefully see that screen now. So this is our landing page. There's multiple ways you can get to Washington data specifically, but you can kind of click on this map. And then we have all of the data and reports available that we've worked on for Washington State. What you do is you click on this, and then it'll populate a download. And that's what this looks like. You can open this up, and then this is our data set for Washington State for 2023. We have multiple tabs at the bottom here that you can access. We did this year do something slightly different. So we calculated 2 self-sufficiency standards, one with the 40th percentile housing costs, which is what we typically do. And then based on some community input, we were also asked to produce housing costs based at the 50th percentile. So you'll notice 2 different options at the bottom there. This is very unique to our partnership with Washington State. There was just a lot of feedback that the 40th percentile data didn't cover what folks felt like the market rate of housing costs were. So what I would suggest if you're accessing this for the first time and you're interested in trying to grab a family type from a particular county, I recommend going to the by family tab, and you'll see it pops up. There's like 719 different family types, a ton of data. But what you do is you go up to the top, you filter, and then you can look at, okay, I want to look at, for example, see, I'm going to select Clark County, and I want to look at a family type with a single adult and a preschooler. So you have one adult and then infant. I know this because I've worked with this a lot, but we have infant, preschoolers, P, school age is S, and then teenager is T. And then that populates, you can see you have a family type of one adult, one preschooler, and one school age child living in Clark County. And then we have the 2 different housing percentile costs. So you can see the difference there. We traditionally use the 40th percentile, and that populates your annual self-sufficiency wage, monthly self-sufficiency wage, and hourly self-sufficiency wage. So hoping that this can be a useful tool for everyone who's interested in accessing the data. We also have plenty of other technical information available on that website too. So with that being said, I'm going to stop share so I can see everyone's faces again, because I feel like sometimes you're talking to the void with these things, and hope that I can answer some questions and I haven't gone too much over my allotted time.
So Annie, there's a question in the chat that you won't be surprised by. People want to know, can you talk about the internet technology costs? Are those now part of the self-sufficiency standard? And can you tell us and give us any hints about the methodology around that?
Absolutely. So we use, I'm going to share my screen again so you can just see that family type that I just populated. This is a recent addition after the pandemic. We recognize that internet is essential for folks who are working or raising children. And we decided that we wanted to add in both broadband and cell phone costs. So I think what might be a little bit easier is if I share the methodology in the chat, so folks can see the full methodology for that. We essentially assume 5 gigabytes for broadband. We use same guidelines that the FCC shares. And then we do a pretty basic cell phone plan, but we do assume that folks are accessing a reasonable amount of data too. And I'd be happy to share the precise sourcing for that in the chat.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions about what ways this data is going to be available to people in this group. Is it going to be, are people going to be able to drill down to census tract and block level, or is all the data that we have for the self-sufficiency standard going to be county or PUMA?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good one. So we calculate the self-sufficiency standard costs by county, and then by some within county variation in King County, Pierce County, Benton County. But the demographic data that we produce, so this is where we look at the benchmark of how many households are falling below the self-sufficiency standard. For that, the smallest geographic region that is available with that micro data set is the PUMA region, which is the public use micro data area. And that has approximately 100,000 people included in each Puma region, and that's really to maintain, because they are actual records of, I don't know if anyone has had the opportunity to respond to an American Community Survey. I did this year and I was very excited. 1% of the population gets to do it. But they try to protect your confidentiality by using that geographic level. So we can't drill down any more than that. We do some comparative work for county where we use some correlating values, but the Puma is the region that we have the most detail geographically, unfortunately.
And for those of us who don't do this every day, what's Puma?
Yeah, it's a public use microdata area, and it's defined by the census. It usually is used solely in Census Bureau work, but a lot of folks who are in the housing world probably are familiar with it, because some of the housing vouchers and median incomes are set based on the Puma region. So not something that a lot of folks are familiar with, but it is a useful geographic analysis if you're looking at the census data.
So another question in the chat has to do with the cost of cable. So I'm guessing, so let me get this, testing my own knowledge of your metric, Annie. I'm guessing that cable is not included, that would be considered entertainment and not in one of the essential metrics that you're trying to track: transportation, childcare, healthcare, etc. So we're getting back to that minimum adequacy standard. And the only thing that I heard you say that we're talking about in terms of internet costs, we're not talking about even devices. We're only talking about the monthly basic cell phone plan with some data, plus an internet home connection, but a broadband connection according to the FCC. Okay.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah, and I'll make sure in the data dictionary that we get that stuff that's highlighted in our data dictionary for NOAANET that we've been compiling. So those details are there for people to reference. Okay, so, all right, so does that mean we cannot get self-sufficiency levels for our county only for 22930 people? So we are going to have county level self-sufficiency data in the NOAANET map, as well as the downloadable CSVs that you guys provide, right? On your site, Annie. So those things will be available to people, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, and just again, it can be a little bit confusing with the two different data sets that we have available, but the first data set is the self-sufficiency standard costs, right? So those are looking at what each cost component that a family is paying for in a basic needs budget. And then we use that to produce the second data set, which is the demographic data set, where we're understanding who is falling below those thresholds that we've defined. You can access that 2023 self-sufficiency standard by county, by family type on our website. It sounds like it's also going to be shared with you as well. The other data set, the demographic data set, will be built into that map function, so folks can look at the percentage of households who are falling below the self-sufficiency standard by their county or by their Puma.
Yeah. So since you're the expert here, I'm sort of running live here with my questions too. So my understanding is like there's two different kinds of ways that we want to be thinking about needs assessment. And your two different ways of using the self-sufficiency data get at those two. And one is the first one, the one that's going to be in the map, is really, that's helping us to understand the level of support that an individual needs, that a single parent with a preschooler, for example, or a two-parent family with two high schoolers, what level of support do they need to be self-sufficient and not have to be relying on government services? So that would be one. And then the other one is looking at a population, right, and being like, how many people in this area will be considered to be not maybe needing some support or being economically vulnerable? Is that a good way to think about it, or am I missing something here?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the second part of that is thinking more about how many people looking at their incomes, looking at what people are earning in a particular region, how many people, how many households, families, earnings are not meeting what it takes to get by at a minimally adequate level. It's really just another way of understanding, not necessarily a super deprivation level analysis like the official poverty measure offers, but really here's how many people are unable to cover their basic needs in a particular region. We also have some variation by race and ethnicity, by family type, by educational attainment. Hopefully that data will be built into the map as well, but that data is all available if folks are more interested in saying, okay, there's a basic percentage. In my county, 38% of households are unable to meet their basic needs, but I want to know more. I want to know how many householders who are naturalized citizens are falling below the self-sufficiency standard. You can also look at that data as well. And I shared the link to the technical brief in the chat. So if individuals are interested in looking more at a long technical brief, all of the information is there for you.
All right. So I think if this is a good next step, Dustin and Sabrina and I are, we're definitely not poverty experts or needs experts or experts around affordability, but we were trying to be an advance guard to try to put ourselves in the role of the broadband action teams and how people would try to crunch the numbers. That was an interesting process of discovery as we tried to work with what NTIA had suggested, the NTIA data and the NTIA maps. We discovered a couple of gotchas there. We also discovered that as Annie referenced, this is part of Washington state law. So the Washington State 2022 Digital Equity Act stipulates using the self-sufficiency standard. There's a second other metric, which I don't understand, maybe Annie understands, that was also in there that is tied to DSHS, which is comparing a specific household, I believe, to the median area income. And I just couldn't find, as a non-expert in this field, we just couldn't find anything that we felt like we could use to make sense of that. And in the time frame. So we kind of made the decision to pivot towards the self-sufficiency standard and trying to get our heads around that, since it's well documented and updated frequently and whatnot, and also becoming more and more widely used across the country, which Annie didn't happen to mention, but there are a number of anti-poverty organizations and cities and other groups that are picking up the self-sufficiency standard. So and it's the guidance. It's one of the guidance that's in the State Digital Equity Act. But what we were trying to reconcile for us is the fact that the sources of funding around this come from the feds, who have different metrics and different benchmarks that they're using. So we were trying to put these things together, and so it could be helpful. We might have Annie making some corrections on the fly, but I'm just going to share my screen with the data dictionary that we've been working on. So so this is definitely a work in progress, as we are learning as we go as non-poverty experts ourselves. So people have access to this. Basically what we're trying to do is take the information that had been compiled in the NOAA map and adding to that what we could find that might be useful to sort of triangulate with future funding opportunities, with the ways that people might be crunching this data. Many people on this call have probably a lot more experience with this stuff than myself or Dustin or Sabrina have, but we were doing our best. So here we have the NOAA map. Again, we're discovering, like, one of the things that we discovered is that NTIA gave us the 100% poverty level metric, was part of the package of layers that was given that NOAA put in. And then as soon as we started digging in, we realized, oh, okay, no one's actually using that for funding, as far as we could tell in the funding digital equity projects. So we decided that we needed to reach out to people like Annie and try to get something else in there that might be more useful and more related to whatever state funding opportunities are going to happen, whatever future planning work is going to happen, as well as at the federal level. So since we discovered that, we've asked NOAA to put in the 150% poverty level metric, which is, I'm going to look over here on this tab, key poverty measures. So the 150% poverty level, that is some of the guidance that comes from NTIA around the BEAD infrastructure grants. That's the starting place. We've got some caveats around that though, that are important, that Dustin did some homework one Sunday afternoon, reading through the NOFOs and other things, and discovered some things around that. The Affordable Connectivity Program, that benchmark is 200% of the federal poverty level. So you can already see here that that's gonna, just in terms of those two ways of thinking, either about, are we providing adequate need to an individual or an individual household? These measures are gonna really change your numbers a lot, as well as population-wise, who's included and who's not. So the overall number, that would change a lot. So we started to do a little documentation on that. We wrote up a little bit of guidance, and this is more, again, I'm going to say that this is work in progress. So it's a little bit like, we're not Annie, we can't become Annie and what they do in this amount of turnaround. But we were trying to just just do our own homework around, okay, what do these mean for future opportunities, and what do they mean for us in terms of thinking about need in a way that is important. So we already talked about on one call that the bottom line is to the best of our knowledge, there is no single standard way to measure broadband affordability. So there's no one that you can go to and say that has that golden ruler, that magic yardstick that everybody is feeling like that does the job and does it well, which means that it's sort of up to individual communities, for better or worse, to make those determinations, even though there are these kind of guidelines. So that is both a challenge and an opportunity for people at the local level. So we put together this table to try to put the definitions together around the key measures that as we understood them. And then we also tried to get into the self-sufficiency standard, because, and I want to show you, if you're looking this table on page 3 and 4, we just took a couple of counties for ourselves one weekend to just try to understand what would be the amounts per family that might be different by these different measures, right? And what we discovered is that if we're using Annie's metric, I picked a family that Annie also happened to call out in her presentation for ease of analysis. So Annie talked about the single family with a preschool age child. So I thought, well, fine, let's do the same and see what that means by the metrics that are being used within NTIA and FCC, since that's, those are probably the biggest yardsticks around in our space. And then what you find is that even we didn't do every single county. I guess we could, if somebody twisted our arms, we probably could do that for you. But what we discovered is that even in counties that you would consider to be lower cost counties for that particular types of family, we're talking about really substantial amounts of money. So even in like Ferry County, if you're going by the seemingly generous amount of measuring need according to the ACP, which is 200% of the federal poverty level, the difference between what that one family type would be in Stevens County, according to the self-sufficiency calculator, 48510. which sounds like that would be a fairly affordable place to live in our state. And yet there's still a discrepancy there, right? At that 200% federal poverty level rate of $9,070. So that's a lot. That's a lot of like work hours from somebody. That's a second job. That's a car, or some major repair of your house. Like that's a lot of money, even in that range. So this isn't us telling you how to do this work, but it's just trying to give you a sense of what the play space here is pretty large and pretty variable. And maybe for that reason, when we dug into the BEAD program here, and this is really what this little write-up here is about, it's just really, Dustin again took like this really tried to dig into the BEAD, how BEAD was talking about affordability and what measures were those. So BEAD on the face of it, it's 150% of the poverty level. But once you get into that, there are actually a lot of caveats in there. So there are a lot of other opportunities for you to tailor how you're doing your need assessment in the finer print. And that is actually the intention. So this is highlighted here in blue. The intention around how BEAD is structured is to provide you with flexibility about how you do this. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And yeah, so maybe over to Sabrina. Or Annie, do you have any comments on any of what I just showed? Because you might have your ideas for us that could improve what we've done.
No, I think that was really helpful. I don't have anything substantial. I think one other place to look when the data is available is when you're looking at our demographic data set. You'll see the count of households who fall below the poverty level, which is based on the 100% of the poverty level, versus the count of households who fall above that poverty level and below the self-sufficiency standard. And typically it's about double what is being reflected in that. So again, to acknowledge the work that you've done there and to acknowledge that large gap that folks are facing.
Thank you, Annie.
So Annie, could you talk about Summer Hess's question, just to make sure we're being really clear?
Sabrina, I'd like to jump in on that one first.
Sure.
Before I talk about how deep we get, I just want to kind of put this in the context that we're in the final month of planning, and we are introducing new resources and considerations that will be very important for the long-term implications of these planning efforts. But for the purpose of the draft of the plan that is due on June 14th, if this is a tool that you feel compelled to use and feel comfortable using within this time frame to support your plan, then would certainly encourage you to do so. But I want to make sure that we emphasize that there is not a pressure to try to understand and figure all of this out in this short period of time, beyond just recognizing that this is an additional way to look at poverty measures and incorporating that into the thinking around digital equity. And it is a metric that the state legislature has identified as one that will be used in this planning at the state level moving forward. But just want to emphasize that well, we're not expecting, for the purposes of the worksheets and the workbook over the next month, that you dive deeply into this data and produce sound conclusions from it. This is a new tool, and it will be, I would certainly recommend that you take this into consideration moving forward. June 14th is certainly not the end of the planning by any means. And just want to kind of put it in that context that part of what we're doing here is trying to make sure that all of the tools are in place and that you're aware of the tools and resources and data that's available to continue this planning beyond this initial push here.
Thanks, Dustin. I just wanted to jump in and say that that helped a lot. And I took my sweater off because I had started sweating thinking about applying this across 3 counties. So I appreciate that context.
Yeah, and I think we did share some guidance to that. Or I think it's been shared, and we definitely talked about it in earlier meetings, right? That there's a level of confidence about your assessment that plays in here. You can be raising questions, and the people that have to read your plans and try to synthesize them, if you're also raising questions and raising these kind of issues, you know, of things that you didn't get time, frankly, weren't given enough time to do, right? You weren't given enough resources or time to sort out. Bringing up those issues as questions or missing data or, you know, future work, I think also has a lot of benefit for advocating for future resources to do what needs to get done.
So Annie, if someone were going to use this data and apply it and somehow package it, like where do they even start? The donut store, because that's, I might go and get a donut and a coffee and then I'd be like, I mean, I see that this is really valuable for communities. Like, you know, if we're looking at a huge gap of folks that aren't having supports addressed because they're being measured by something blunt from the 60s, like, so there's that. But really, like, in a really practical sense, how does one start?
Well, I think accessing the data, looking through the data, understanding what cost components we are including, and then also being aware, I think, of the nuance of different household types. I think related to Summer's question, you know, in an ideal world, when someone is applying for a work support or housing support or food support, they would be able to look at their self-sufficiency standard based on their family type, based on their location, to really understand, oh, I don't have enough to cover food here, so I could use the support. But we work in state bureaucracies, me included, that sometimes using these extra detailed, minute data sets can be challenging and complicated and just add more of a headache than help. So I hope that what people will do is just start by exploring the data by a family type that is relevant to your county or your household, and understand from that perspective, start there, what cost components are going into it, the tax credits that are available to folks, the taxes that they're paying, and then potentially compare that with common measures that you're using for other income adequacy measurements, such as 200 to 250% of the federal poverty guidelines, just to understand, okay, is there a big gap? Or in my county, is that could that be a potentially sufficient threshold if I'm using 200 to 250? And where are the gaps? So if for a family type of, you know, one adult with one infant and one preschooler, that's going to be a really high cost because they're going to be paying a lot for childcare. So that gap is probably going to be a lot wider for the federal poverty guidelines. But, you know, so acknowledging that, noting that, and then hopefully incorporating that into more of a nuanced perspective when you're doing this work. I know that's not a great answer of like, here's how you do this, but I think accessing the data is the first step, and understanding where the data is coming from is the second step.
Thank you. Okay, any questions to round it out?
Maybe just an observation, since this is I was looking through the methodology that you shared, Annie, and I think it would be worth, I know it's always helpful to use federal standards for things, but it might be helpful to kind of reconsider the way that the FCC describes broadband, because they developed that the current definition back in 2015, and as we know, a lot of things have changed in the past 8 years around bandwidth demands and requirements to actually participate and use it in different ways. Don't necessarily have the federal standard that we could use for that, but I think as they describe it in that methodology, saying that like a 4 megabit per second plan can support any sort of real use, I think is not really accurate. So I guess I would just kind of recommend some additional research into other ways to frame that and build it into the methodology.
Certainly, I think we can absolutely do that. And if you have any resources on sort of minimal requirements that are designated by the federal government, I would love to read through them. This is definitely a new addition to the standard. And we are hoping to continue to refine it and ensure that we're meeting the basic needs that folks have.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, thanks for all that. Just this, Dave Keys, just a quick note on that maybe one potential thing you could use is the second tier level of service that's being offered in the Affordable Connectivity Program. So, like for Comcast, that's the Internet Essentials Plus. So not a perfect measure, but that's at least one kind of, level of service that's out there could look at.
Thank you. Yeah, I took note of that, and I will take a look at it after the call.
So, David, how would you envision that, in a place like rural Whitman County where there isn't an Internet Essentials package, where, like, for instance, where I'm sitting right now, where it's, a $70 a month, $70 a month for 25/3 with a $600, installation fee for the LTE modem.
Yeah, I think
basically in a place where that isn't ubiquitous.
Yeah, and that's part of, in part why that's also held down the sort of base minimum FCC standard, and why that standard is so far behind as well. So, and where the state adopted other goals beyond that, in part recognizing that we still have to get broadband and kind of get broadband out, get decent broadband out, get quality broadband out to different areas. I mean, I think, I'm curious about maybe there's a way that could be couched for sort of regional availability. I don't know if that's true for any of the other measures or quality of services of what's available in the self-sufficiency thing, standard of what's actually available in an area. I mean, I think it's an important point, though.
Well, and maybe the availability, the percentage of availability of, Annie, not to throw something into your research, but in the Puma, what percent of BSLs would have that Internet Essentials available to them, or a technology that could provide Internet Essentials over it?
So, I mean, in some ways it doesn't, the cost would change. Doesn't necessarily change what's sufficient for a household, right? You could still have that, what it takes for family of 4 to do their schoolwork and do their homework on, do their work online. But in
Yeah,
terms of what's available.
I was more thinking, hey, this percentage of BSLs in a Puma has access to fiber or
Right.
fiber cable.
I don't think that the American Community Survey measures that, but if there's another data source that collects that information that we could potentially include into the baseline cost calculation, that would be very useful.
So the FCC BBC, of its many failings, actually does have that and has it at the resolution, Annie, that you should be able to include it. And if you want to connect offline, we can chat through that.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I love that this has turned into a discussion about how we can better my methodology in the broadband. I think it's great and it's necessary. So I appreciate that.
just adding to that quickly, not to drag it out too much, but I just flagged that you should look into the FCC's new research license for the broadband data, because they've opened it up to be able to use it for research purposes in a way that is much more granular than others can use it for. So just something to look into.
Great.
Just
Thank
following
you.
in the chat that Martha from Whidbey Telecom flagged the USDA resource as well in the chat as a possible resource.
Well, thank you everyone for taking this time today. I will stay on and stop the recording just in case anyone has any questions or wants to chat. All right. Thank you.